This is AQA A-level philosophy, epistemology and moral philosophy, and then this is going to be section 1, epistemology 1.1, what is knowledge? Okay, so the main definition of knowledge given is JTB, which is justified true belief. This is known as the tripartite definition, and in his book Theaetetus, Plato argues knowledge is justified true belief. That word is spelled Theaetetus. In justified true belief, there are necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge. JTB, justified true beliefs, are all necessary for knowledge, but only together do they become sufficient for knowledge. This means that they capture every instance of knowledge whilst not capturing anything that isn't knowledge, which is what the Gettier cases try and challenge. Let's talk about the Gettier cases. Problem, Gettier cases. Gettier, he's a person. Gettier's paper describes two scenarios where an individual has a justified true belief that is not knowledge. So case 1 is Smith and Jones are interviewing for the same job. Smith hears the interviewer say, "I'm going to give Jones the job." Smith also sees Jones count 10 coins from his pocket. Smith, from this, forms the belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. But regardless, Smith actually is the one who gets the job, not Jones. It's just by coincidence that Smith happens to also have 10 coins in his pocket. So in this case, it's justified. So he hears the interviewer and sees the coins. So he can, his reasons are justified, and then it's also a true belief, because the man with 10 coins does get the job. In case 2, it's basically either London is the capital of England or the moon is made of cheese. It's that type of case. But the real case is either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona, which is being Smith's belief, and only one is true. So, and examples like this are called disjunction introduction, which is an if-or statement, if-or-then statement, in which you can have multiple kind of clauses for your justification. For your belief. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the other definitions of knowledge. The first one being reliabilism. If P is caused by a reliable method, which is basically one that causes a higher percentage of true beliefs. A problem with this is fake barn counting, which is the belief that there is a fake barn in fake barn, that there is a real barn in fake barn county is not formed by a reliable process. Reliabilism is useful, however, as it allows children and animals to obtain knowledge, as they don't have the means to justify it, and in some other cases there's justification needed, such as justified true belief. So you could say that children have no beliefs if they can't justify themselves. Then let's talk about virtue epistemology. It says that, quote, James's true belief that P is a result of James exercising his intellectual virtues. James's true belief that P is a result of is a result of James exercising his intellectual virtues. Ernest Sosa says that virtue epistemology is based on accurate, adroit, and apt beliefs. Well, yeah, but he would just describe it as AAA instead of AAAB. Accurate is true, which is why we don't have the B. Adroit is that a virtue is used, and apt is that it is true because a virtue is used. In terms of virtue epistemology, Linda Zagzeski says that there is no condition of truths, and that knowledge is cognitive contact with reality. An issue with this is that baby and animals can't be virtuous because they don't have the ability yet to use their pronesis. Okay, so they can't have knowledge. Then we have infallibilism, which is means that the belief must be justified in a way that proves absolute certainty, which means the impossibility of doubt. A problem with this is that it is too strict, and because nearly everything can be doubted to a certain extent. And finally we have justified true belief plus no false lemmas, which states that, for example, P is true. James believes that P is true. James's belief is justified. James did not infer that P is the case from anything false. This no false lemmas argument aims to strengthen justified true belief rather than contradict it. No false lemmas, false lemma means that something is inferred from something false. So a lemma is an inference, and a false lemma is something inferred from something false. So if I said I want to go out for a walk today, if I said it would be a great day for a walk today because it was sunny, and I looked outside and it wasn't sunny, then that would be a false lemma. It's good because it avoids Gettier case 1, as the coin's inference is made through a false lemma, so it would say that it wouldn't be knowledge that Jones will get the job. But an issue with it, again, is fake Barn County, because if Henry points out a real barn to his son in fake Barn County, due to just luck, despite the fact that there's the problem is fake Barn County, Henry sees a real barn in fake Barn County, but this is clearly luck despite the fact that it's not inferred from anything false, and that is justified true belief and other definitions of knowledge. This is A Level Philosophy, Section 1 Epistemology, 1.2 Perception as a source of knowledge, aka knowledge from perception. Okay, these are the different types of knowledge from perception. Let's start with direct realism, the most basic one. It believes that when you look at something, you directly perceive its properties. It's the belief that the world is mind independent, so it exists without you, and that the external world exists independently of the mind, hence the term realism after direct. And we perceive it directly, hence direct before realism. No notable philosophers follow it, is an interesting fact. A problem with this, there's 4 problems. There's illusion with an I. So if a pen in water appears bent, yet it isn't, A direct realist would argue that the pen has the property of looking crooked, yet this doesn't explain the argument from hallucinations. So they're able to counter the illusion argument with the pen looking crooked, but they're not able to counter the hallucination argument, which is a more extreme version of the illusion argument, the perception of things that aren't actually there. And these perceptions cannot be direct, as they do not exist in the physical realm. Could be a counter-argument, but it's much, much harder to counter it with indirect realism. Then we have number 3, perception variation. Bertrand Russell created the argument from perceptual variation, in which he said that different shadows / height, depending on the position of the perceptor, change the way we directly perceive things, trying to refute direct realism. Russell mentions the position of a table specifically in his example, and this is at direct realism's fault, because direct realism states that there should be no such differences between perception and reality, despite different people can experience perceptual variation. For example, colorblind people and stuff like that. Then we have the time lag argument. When we see light from the sun, there is a time lag of 8 minutes. However, direct realism would argue that you are perceiving light from the sun directly, but the time lag between the sun and the earth is just an unfortunate fact, which doesn't actually disprove it, which I think is fair enough. So the main argument is the perceptual variation argument. Then we have knowledge from perception, indirect realism, which focuses on sense data, which it describes as private data viewed by the individual that is the content of perceptual experience, which is used to explain and justify perceptual variation. In indirect realism, there are primary and secondary qualities. John Locke created these and wrote about these. Primary qualities are properties inherent to the object itself, such as the shape, size. Oh no, not shape. No, it is shape. Shape, size, and number. Whereas secondary qualities are properties of an object, powers of an object to cause sensation in human, such as color, taste, and smell. Locke uses examples to illustrate this distinction. He says, porphyry, which is Porphyry, is a red and white stone whose colours vanish in the dark, yet its primary qualities remain. So even in the dark, something will still retain its primary qualities. Problems with indirect realism is the argument of skepticism. You can argue what difference to the perceiver is there if there was no physical world at all, and the answer to that is none. We cannot go beyond the veil of perception. Bertrand Russell concedes there is no way to conclusively defeat the skeptical argument. However, a mind-dependent world is the best explanation for sense data. So, we cannot prove that there is a physical world, but it's the best explanation for all the sense data that we're perceiving. Locke, however, argues that there must be an external world, as unlike the mind, we cannot choose to perceive what we perceive. So, unlike when we close our eyes and we think of a bike, if we're shown a bike in this world, we just see it. His second reply to the skepticism problem is that the different senses confirm each other's information. For example, you can write on paper and then see the words following writing on it. However, does this disprove it? The information you have may be equally misrepresentative of the external world as the information you see. So who knows? I think Bertrand Russell's example is a bit better than that. Counter-argument even. And then third and finally, we have idealism. By the way, quick fact, knowledge from perception comes a posteriori, so post-perception. Idealism is the belief that all that exists are ideas, and it's an anti-realist theory. Bishop Berkeley came up with it in the 18th century, and he said that in his three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, that God causes ideas, so there is no skepticism needed. He says that the variation of the skeptical argument, he has a variation of the skeptical argument presented, which is that if realism is true, how can we link our perception to the objects behind it? So he's linking it back to the skeptical argument and kind of adhering to it, saying that no, we can't look past the veil of perception, we just have to accept it. And then on top of that, Bishop Berkeley attacks Locke's primary-secondary quality distinction with the master argument, saying that we cannot conceive a mind-independent object because as soon as we do, it becomes mind-dependent, so it's just impossible. He also says perceptual variation means that primary qualities depend on the mind just as much as secondary qualities do. So therefore, there is no distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Therefore, all is mind-dependent. But despite this, everything constantly exists in the mind as God, which is why time goes on when you leave an apple and you come back to it and it rots. Alright, now problems with idealism. The first being solipsism. What reason is there to believe that the minds of others exist at all? All is just ideas, so how do we know other people exist? And then the second set of problems is hallucination and illusions. In terms of hallucinations, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. Should we consider hallucinations real within idealism? And then illusions. Is the pencil made to look crooked by if the pencil is made to look crooked by the light, then the idealist would have to consider the pen being crooked despite the fact that it isn't. And that concludes knowledge from perception. Thank you. This is Philosophy, Section 1, Epistemology, Reason as a Source of Knowledge. Okay, so reason as a source of knowledge, aka knowledge from reason. One of the key, so first we'll do some definitions. First we have a priori, which means knowledge pre, something happening, and then a posteriori, which is knowledge post something happening. Then we have analytic truth, which is something that is true in virtue in the meaning of words, such as a triangle has three sides would be an analytic truth. And then you have synthetic truth, which is true in the virtue of how the world is. For example, the grass is green. Rationalism says that there are some synthetic truths which can be known a priori, whereas empiricism says that all knowledge of synthetic truths is gained a posteriori. Okay, first we'll talk about Descartes and his meditations. Descartes said that dubito, ergo cogito, ergo sum, which means I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am, aka ergo sum, ergo cogito, or cogito ergo sum. That was quite fast, sorry. This means that existing is a clear and distinct idea, and it cannot be doubted. Descartes' meditations prove that intuition and deduction are a priori knowledge, if that is what we are able to use to find out that the only piece of real knowledge that we have is the undoubtable knowledge that we have is that we exist. So intuition and deduction are a priori functions. Then we have the three waves of doubt. These are illusion, which means that you can doubt sense experience. Then he had the second wave, which was dreaming, which means that he was able to doubt being awake. And the third wave of doubt was deception, in which you can doubt that you are being perceived by an evil demon. And this is the extreme doubt known as skepticism in the deception part. To be fair, in all of them as well. Alright, now we're moving on to his arguments for existence of God. Firstly, he had Descartes' ontological argument, which I think I'll explain now. I think I'll find it in the book. I can't find it, whatever. You can do your own research. And then we have the trademark argument, which I do know about, which is the fact that idea of God, the fact that the idea of God is innate, means that God has put the idea in the mind, human mind, as a trademark. Problems with this are Hume's fork, which say that the relation of ideas are analytic and a priori, and matters of fact are synthetic and a posteriori. This is an issue because I don't know. To be honest, I'll have to look up on that. Then we have so that's the problem is Hume's fork, basically, in the Descartes meditations. Then we have innate knowledge, an example of which is Plato. Plato said we have innate knowledge. He used the example of Meno's slave, saying that Meno's slave hasn't been taught geometry. Socrates draws a square on the ground that is 2 by 2 feet, 2 feet by 2 feet. Socrates asks Meno's slave a series of questions, and then Meno's slave assumes correctly the answers, which leaves Socrates and apparently Plato to realise that the area of the square is... leaves the slave to realise that the area of the square is 4 feet despite having no knowledge of geometry. An issue with this is that, I'll get onto the issues in a minute. Leibniz came up with the idea of necessary truths in innate knowledge. He holds the belief that all existential propositions, except the existence of God, are contingent truths, and for him, necessary truths carry no commitment to the existence of anything, whereas contingent truths are related in some way to experience and time. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a necessary truth, which must be innate, and because of this, knowledge of necessary truths is innate. Problems with this are the arguments against innate knowledge. In the Menno-slave example, children and idiots do not innately know the complex theories of geometry. Even the slave doesn't, which is what Locke said. Observations in unborn babies show that they don't have any concepts beyond those experienced in the womb, such as warmth and pain. Babies and entire societies do not have the concepts of God, so God cannot be an innate idea. But Leibniz responds by saying that it is possible to have innate concepts and not be aware of them. On top of this, John Locke had an essay concerning Hume's understanding, saying that abstract general ideas, the first heading being abstract general ideas, which means that all concepts, trees, beauty and God, are derived from the experiences associated with them, and they cannot be innate. So a tree is an abstract idea, God is an abstract idea, and beauty is an abstract idea, because there's so many different variables. And then tabula rasa, which states that the mind at birth is blank, and that all things, concepts, come from experience, and therefore nothing can be innate. And that is knowledge from reason. This is philosophy, section 2, moral philosophy, and then we're doing all the ethical theories in this little voice memo. Okay, let's start with utilitarianism. First we have act utilitarianism, which was made by Jeremy Bentham. Point 1 of it is whether or not an action is right or wrong depends on solely on the consequences. Point 2 is that the only thing that is good is happiness, so pleasure is the only thing that's good. And 3, no individual's happiness is more important than anyone else's. Like I said, Jeremy Bentham created this, and he also created the hedonic, aka philippic calculus, which says that more pleasure is greater than less pleasure, and that morally good actions, good in quotes, maximize happiness. Then we have rule utilitarianism, which focuses on the consequences of general rules rather than specific actions, but still does focus on the outcomes, like act utilitarianism. It was created by John Stuart Mill, who said that there are higher and lower pleasures. His quote is, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Semicolon, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." In terms of the tyranny of the majority, if you lived in a society where people were falsely imprisoned, you wouldn't worry about it. You would worry about it happening to you, and you would not trust the public or the state. But rule utilitarianism works against this by applying the rule of not falsely imprisoning people despite the pleasure that might be received from it. Problems with utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism, it is difficult to calculate the hedonic calculus. It's hard to decide between the long-lasting and short-lived pleasure. There are 7 different variables to derive from. It's impossible to determine the individual levels of happiness perceived sort of by everyone, and everyone is different, and it's hard to make a choice in a quick amount of time. For act utilitarianism, the tyranny of the majority is a problem, because it means it would be morally right to imprison someone wrongly if it is what the majority wants. Another problem is that it doesn't focus on the moral status of particular friendships. So if you have a unique moral status, such as, I don't know, wife and husband, making them happy would be less valuable than making 2 random people on the street happy, making their day, which is overlooked by act utilitarianism. And that is utilitarianism. It's a consequentialist theory, which means that the consequences of an action make it right or wrong, in this case pain and pleasure. Then we have preference utilitarianism, which says that sometimes we might prefer something even if it doesn't maximize pleasure. So it's an objection to Bentham's and Mill's hedonism. Carrying out the wishes of the dead may not bring about happiness, yet it's still the preferred action, and it's still the morally right thing to do. Robert Nozick said in his virtual reality machine, aka pleasure machine, that the pleasure machine shouldn't be preferred, even though it's the most pleasurable thing. So he's kind of alluding to preference utilitarianism being the most, the best out of the 3. Then let's do Aristotle's virtue ethics. So in Aristotle's virtue ethics, that we have the good life is the end goal, which is eudaimonia, aka, which is the final end, something that is desired for its own sake. In terms of eudaimonia is a point of human flourishing at which a person fulfills their individual sort of design even. Eudaimonia is achieving the good life through human flourishing, being guided by reason, which is through the ergon/function, which we'll get onto in a minute. So the reason is the ergon/function through the arte/virtuous actions, which we'll get onto in a minute. Sorry if that's confusing. They say that virtues as habits is good to achieve. They say that agent central actions practiced, if you practice your agent central actions, you'll be able to reach eudaimonia. So like, it's kind of like helping others to help yourself, basically. Virtues as habits, act virtuously through the use of practical wisdom, aka pronesis. Only voluntary acts should be praised. So you can't go up to someone and say, "Oh, look at me! Look what the great thing I've done." And you can't say, "Oh, I got paid for it as well." That's not virtuous. In Aristotle's virtue ethics, they believe in the doctrine of the mean / the golden mean, in that virtues are averages between 2 extremes. However, an extreme can be the mean. The arte / the ergon. These are just basically some philosophical words. The arte is the virtue, the specific virtue that allows the completion of the ergon, and the ergon is the function of a thing. So if I said my function is to ride a bike, that would be my function, and then the arte would be being fit enough to ride the bike. Problems with Aristotelian virtue ethics is its circularity, and that Aristotle defines virtuous acts and virtuous people in the terms of each other, which is circular. However, Aristotle also defines virtuous people in terms of eudaimonia, so in this case it's not fully circular. Another problem is competing virtues. For example, justice and mercy could conflict, so there's someone who's accidentally killed their husband, but like by extreme accident. You want to be merciful, but you want to impose justice at the same time as virtues. So these conflict. However, practical wisdom will choose the right choice, and in a case there can only be one like specific chosen better virtue. Another problem is there's no clear guidance in it. There is no categorical imperative or hedonic calculus to guide the individual. Some people argue that the golden mean is too vague. However, Aristotle would say that life is more complicated than a set of rules such as the hedonic calculus or categorical imperative. Yeah, and that's Aristotle's virtue ethics. Now we have Kant's deontological ethics. Summary. This believes that the only thing that is good without question or qualification is goodwill. Basically qualification, scrap the question. 2. Goodwill means acting for the sake of duty. 3. You have a duty to follow the moral law. 4. Moral laws are universal. Maxims, basically. 5. You can tell if a maxim is universal if it passes the categorical imperative. And 6. Don't treat people as a means to an end, which is the humanity formula. So goodwill. Goodwill is acting from a sense of duty, rather than in Aristotelian virtue ethics. The good life is acting according to your phronesis. There's more about duty, and Kant argues that the source of all moral worth is duty, and being selfless without expecting nothing is goodwill. In terms of duty, we have a duty to follow the moral law, which is summarized by the categorical imperative and the innate law. In terms of maxims, there are hypothetical maxims and categorical maxims. Hypothetical will say do X if you want Y, whereas categorical just say do X no matter what. And the categorical imperative. There's 2 tests to this, and it's used to see if laws or maxims are universalizable. So the first test means that the maxim must not be a contradiction in conception, so it cannot be self-contradictory. For example, stealing. If I stole private property and made this a maxim, it would devolve its meaning because there would be no meaning of private property if everyone was allowed to steal, meaning that stealing becomes impossible through stealing. Therefore, it is a contradiction in conception, and you have the perfect duty not to follow said maxim. Test 2, second test, is the contradiction in will, which says that can we rationally will the maxim? For example, not to help others in need. This creates an imperfect duty where it is sometimes wrong to follow the maxim. So in the contradiction in will, you have to be able to rationally will the maxim. You can't rationally will that everyone would steal. Another almost third test but not really the third test, but technically the third test, is the humanity formulation. or humanity formula, which says that treat people, quote, never simply as a means to an end, but always as the same. Oh, never simply treat people, quote, never simply as a means, but always as the same time as an end, which is a bit cyclical in nature, the way he's written it, but it's basically treat people as an end in and of themselves. So the categorical imperatives used to see if laws can be universalized to everyone. Alright, let's look at the problems. Problems include, it's difficult to apply. For example, stealing maxim that had the, if there's a stealing maxim that said only 9 letters in their name, like only steal from people who have 9 letters in their name, wouldn't stop the concept of private property, and it can still be willed. It can't be willed rationally. An argument against that would be it's against the will to steal from people who have the 9 letters in their name. But it destroys the contradiction of will. Another problem is that it ignores consequences. For example, if you kill one person to save 100 people, that's not allowed in Kantian ethics, because it's focused on the act, and you don't want to kill anyone. So you're not allowed to kill, despite how many people it might save. Another problem is conflict between duties. For example, you must break a perfect duty to save a life. So there's a contradiction in maxims. Another problem is that it ignores other valuable who knows. Basically, if you're visiting an ill friend from concern, if you're visiting an ill friend from concern, this has a less moral value than visiting even though you hate them from duty. So it ignores other valuable information and that. And that is the ethical theories all summarised, and all the information you need for that. This is Philosophy Applied Ethics, and let's start with stealing. Now, what do utilitarians say about stealing? Well, an act utilitarian would say that it depends on the happiness created from the act of stealing. For example, if the stealing person is starving, whereas a rule utilitarian would say that having and maintaining a rule of quote-unquote don't steal would lead to a better overall society. But there are many ways that there may be individual cases where the need for pleasure is excusable through stealing. So, pardon me, sometimes utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism does accept stealing. Then we have Kant's deontological ethics, which says that stealing would lead to a contradiction in conception, as willing the maxim of stealing to be universalized would mean that the concept of private property would cease to exist, and you would no longer be able to steal. Then we have Aristotle's virtue theory, which says there are some acts which never fall into the golden mean, and stealing is one of them. So these are V rules that Aristotle set out. He argues that it depraves a person of what is fairly theirs, and he also says that there are unjust actions and unjust state of affairs, and that unjust state of affairs just happens sometimes. For example, being poor and not being able to feed your family doesn't mean that you should commit an unjust action and steal. An unjust action has moral weight, whereas an unjust state of affairs doesn't have any moral weight. On the topic of stimulated killing, a act utilitarian would say that it's allowed, because the user the gamer, gets pleasure without anyone being harmed, whereas a rule utilitarian would argue that if stimulated killing affects the rule of do not kill in the real world, then it would be considered immoral. Otherwise, it's fine. Kant's deontological ethics says that murdering people in video games does not lead to a contradiction in conception, a contradiction in will, or violate the humanity formula. However, you can't really will everyone to take part in stimulating killing and playing Call of Duty, can you? Aristotle's virtue, so it's a contradiction almost in will, really, because you can't universalize it, realistically. Aristotle's virtue theory on stimulated killing says that we'd be wasting our time doing stimulated killing rather than reaching eudaimonia. And enjoying killing, simulated or not, I've been saying stimulated, is not virtuous, unless it is a Greek tragedy where values and virtues are learnt and emotions are experienced. He says that if you are using your phronesis to kill people repeatedly, you could eventually develop the vice of cruelty, potentially. Then we have eating animals. An Acts utilitarian would say that Bentham specifically asks, can they suffer? And the answer is yes. So it is bad if the animals lived cruel lives and died poorly. But if farming didn't exist, many of these animals wouldn't exist anyway, so you might as well just kill them and eat them. A rule utilitarian would say that it is good to have a rule of a well-developed, uncruel means of farming, but otherwise go ahead and eat the animals. Aristotle's virtue theory says that eudaimonia is only concerned with the good of life of human beings, and that animals are subservient to humans regardless. Kant would argue that the maxim "it's okay to eat animals" has no contradiction in will or in conception. But a little offshoot, though, you could say that maybe there's people who are allergic to meat. Who knows? So there could be a contradiction in will. Or you could argue there's a contradiction in conception if everyone eats all the meat and there's no meat left. Then no one can eat meat. But then again, that's very unlikely because everyone's farming. The categorical imperative can only apply to rational beings, and pigs and cows are not rational beings. But then again, neither are babies, so why don't we just eat babies? The humanity formula is also only applicable to humans. Interesting. Alright, telling lies. An act utilitarianism, a utilitarian would say it depends on the situation at hand. For example, white lies are permissible. And maybe bigger lies in life and death situations, whereas rule utilitarianism says that the rule, quote-unquote, never lie, would lead to greater happiness than a rule that demanded the inverse. For example, a society without trust would become morally decrepit. Kant's deontological ethics, if you use the maxim lie, there's a contradiction in will there, because then everyone can't will that. There's a contradiction in conception in that you can't have everyone lying, because then the concept of lying disappears, and it breaks the humanity formula, in the sense that if I lied to you and you really wanted to know something, I'd be using you as a means to an end, when you probably just wanted to find out information, and I'm trying to feel good by not hurting your feelings or whatever. So it doesn't fulfill the categorical imperative. And then Aristotle's virtue theory says that telling lies is the opposite of moderation, and lying undermines the character as it exerts the vice of dishonesty, and in the long term it destroys the individual's chances of achieving eudaimonia. And that is applying the ethical theories. This is Metaethics, starting with an introduction to metaethics. And metaethics is how to determine / calculate the semantic meanings of good / bad, etc. How to determine and calculate the semantic meanings of good or bad. Okay, there are two different approaches to metaethics. The first is cognitive, which is objective, realist, focuses on ethical naturalism and intuitionalism. And then the second half is non-cognitive, which is subjective, anti-realist, focuses on emotivism and prescriptivism. So, moral realism and anti-realism are concerned about whether something is objective or mind-dependent. Moral realism believes that there is an objective truth, so it's cognitive, whereas anti-realists don't believe objects exist in the world, and the words we use, such as good and bad, are subjective. So that's like when we're talking about knowledge from perception, it's almost like idealism. So cognitivism and non-cognitivism are concerned with whether the sentences in which we talk about these things express beliefs that are true or false. For example, cognitism believes that factual statements are either true or false, whereas non-cognitism believes that factual statements are in fact non-factual statements and are just expressions of belief and opinion. Because of this, they are neither true or false. Here's the different types of realists. Some realists, such as utilitarians, argue that there are natural properties that our moral terms pick out, such as pleasure or pain caused by an action. This position is known as moral naturalism. Other types of realists, such as G.E. Moore, reject naturalism and argue that there are special, non-natural features of the world which our moral terms refer to and which can be known through moral intuitions. This is known as non-naturalism. Okay, and that's the introduction. And now I move on to A.J. Ayer's emotivism theory. Key quotes. This is A.J. In every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the ethical term is purely emotive. It is used to express feelings about certain objects, but not to make assertions about them. And then the second quote is, if I say stealing is wrong, I produce a sentence with no factual meaning. It is as if I had written, stealing money, 2 exclamation marks, where the shape and the thickness of the exclamation marks show a special sort of moral disapproval. And this is from A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic book. The background to emotivism. It was developed from intuitionalism and looked at the nature of what we would intuitively would say. A leading emotivist was A.J. Ayer, who drew heavily on the ethical theories of logical positivists. The logical positivists argue that statements only had meaning if they were verifiable through sense experience. Emotivism is the total rejection of the mysteries of intuitionalism. Intuitionalism asserts that there exists mysterious moral facts which we can somehow intuit. Emotivism is also described as a reaction to Moore's confident pronouncement as to what was and what wasn't good. A.J. Ayer plus emotivism. In Language, Truth and Logic, Ayer states that his aim is to establish the purpose of philosophical inquiry and ensure philosophers no longer waste their time on disputes which have no foundation and cannot be resolved through a philosophical method. Ayer uses and creates his verification principle, aka VP, while it has, which has origins in Hume's fork. The negative principle establishes analytic and synthetic statements. That's the link. VP, verification principle applied to ethical statements. Moral judgments are not true by definition. Moral judgments cannot be verified or falsified, as there is no fact / property in which they could possibly refer to. So Ayer is both a non-cognitivist and an anti-realist about moral language. He concludes that moral statements have no factual significance and that moral concepts such as good and right were mere pseudo-concepts. If you choose to apply logical positivism, this happens. The moral statements will have no cognitive meaning according to Ayer if 1. They do not express facts which can be verified, 2. They are not tautologies, 3. They cannot be grasped intuitively. Okay, and then we have more information on the emotivism theory. Does Ayer believe that moral statements are pointless? No, because we make moral statements that express non-cognitive meaning. For example, the statement that abortion is wrong is a statement about our feelings toward abortion, rather than a moral fact, as there are no moral facts, he believes. This means that emotivism is roughly based on the goodness and or badness of the individual situation, or the individual perception. Moral judgments are expressions of emotion, is another thing that Ayer said. He said that they are descriptions of our sympathetic responses to other people's behaviours, which means that Ayer's theory is clearly a form of emotivism. And emotivists are able to explain why it is that a moral judgment motivate us through internalism, which means that they motivate us because they express emotion and appeal to our emotion, and we want to do things that others approve of, and moral judgments motivate us from that to do exactly that. C.L. Stevenson is a different theorist, and he argued that moral judgments which employed terms like good and right were not simply expressions of a feeling, as Ayer had maintained, but were also attempts to influence other people, to persuade them to feel as we feel, and to have the same attitude that we have. For example, that's a good song, or I like this song, is basically saying that's a good song is basically like saying I like this song and so should you. Stevenson is able to give an account of how moral terms motivate us or guide our actions by saying they do so like someone shouting or arguing at us to do something, they motivate us through the power of emotions, the emotions behind the words. So another emotivist theory. And that's the end of metaethics.